October 1781. A cold rain falls over a shattered landscape in Virginia. Thousands of British soldiers stand trapped behind collapsing earthworks. Their cannon are broken. Their food is running low. Their commander, Lord Cornwallis, has nowhere left to go. In front of him waits an army that should not exist. American farmers, French infantry, black soldiers, German immigrants, men who have marched without shoes, gone months without pay, and survived years of defeat. Behind him, French warships control the Chesapeake Bay. The most powerful empire on earth has been cornered by 13 colonies that began the war divided, nearly bankrupt, and almost completely unprepared. Soon, British drums will beat a slow march. A sword will be offered in surrender, and the world will be forced to accept something that once seemed impossible. The British Empire has lost America. But Yorktown was not the moment the revolution began. It was the moment years of anger, fear, ambition, sacrifice, betrayal, and astonishing luck finally came together. Because the American Revolution was never simply a story of brave colonists rising against a cruel king. It was a civil war between neighbors. It was a global conflict fought from Canada to the Caribbean, from the Atlantic Ocean to India. It was a war in which enslaved people pursued freedom while slaveholders demanded liberty. It was a war that divided native nations, destroyed families, ruined fortunes, created legends, and exposed the enormous distance between American ideals and American reality. And for most of the struggle, the Americans were losing. To understand how 13 colonies defeated the British Empire, we must begin not with rebellion, but with victory. In 1763, Britain stood at the height of its power. For nearly a decade, British and French forces had fought across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. In America, colonists called the conflict the French and Indian War. In the wider world, it was part of the 7 Years' War. Britain emerged triumphant. France lost Canada. British territory expanded across vast stretches of North America. London had broken its greatest rival and gained an empire larger than anything the British government had previously controlled. Church bells rang. Bonfires burned. Many colonists celebrated as loyal subjects of King George III. Men from Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other colonies had fought beside British regulars. Among them was a young Virginia officer named George Washington, who gained military experience, survived disaster, and learned lessons he would carry into a very different war. The victory of 1763 should have united Britain and its colonies. Instead, it began the process that tore them apart. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain now carried a crushing national debt. It also had to defend a larger empire and maintain troops in North America. From the perspective of officials in London, the solution appeared reasonable. The colonies had benefited from the war. Therefore, the colonies should help pay for it. But the colonists saw the situation differently. For generations, Britain had practiced what historians later called salutary neglect. Parliament passed trade regulations, but enforcement was often inconsistent. Colonial assemblies collected taxes, managed local affairs, and grew accustomed to governing themselves. The colonists did not think of themselves as independent, but they had learned to expect a remarkable degree of autonomy. Then, almost overnight, the empire began to tighten its grip. In 1763, the British government issued a proclamation attempting to restrict colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The goal was to reduce frontier warfare and stabilize relations with native nations after a major indigenous uprising associated with the Ottawa leader Pontiac. To British officials, limiting Western settlement was practical. To land-hungry colonists, speculators, and veterans who expected Western property, it felt like betrayal. The empire had just won an enormous territory from France. Now it was telling its own colonists not to enter it. The question was no longer simply who ruled the frontier. The question was who had the right to decide. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, strengthening customs enforcement and placing duties on imported goods. The following year came the Stamp Act. This law reached into the daily life of the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, licenses, contracts, pamphlets, playing cards, and many other printed materials required an official stamp purchased from the government. The tax itself was not always financially devastating. Its meaning was far more dangerous. Colonists had long been taxed by their own elected assemblies. Now Parliament, an institution thousands of miles away in which the colonies had no elected representatives, was taxing them directly. British leaders argued that Parliament represented all British subjects through a concept known as virtual representation. The colonists rejected that claim. Their answer became a slogan: no taxation without representation. At first, resistance came through speeches, petitions, and legal argument. Then it moved into the streets. In Boston, a loose network of activists known as the Sons of Liberty organized demonstrations. Effigies of tax officials were hung from trees. Homes were attacked. Stamp distributors were intimidated into resigning. One of the most important voices of resistance was Samuel Adams, a skilled political organizer who understood something that British officials did not. A local grievance could become a continental cause if it was given the right language. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Colonial leaders met in New York at the Stamp Act Congress. Newspapers carried arguments from one colony to another. The colonies had resisted imperial policies before, but now they were beginning to resist together. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Across America, colonists celebrated as if liberty itself had been saved. But on the same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that it possessed the power to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The tax was gone. The argument remained, and it was growing more dangerous. In 1767, Parliament tried again. The Townshend Acts placed duties on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Revenue from these duties would help pay royal officials in America, making governors and judges less dependent on colonial assemblies. That detail mattered. The conflict was no longer only about money. It was about power. If the king could pay colonial officials without the consent of elected assemblies, then those officials could ignore local pressure. The balance that had shaped colonial government for generations could be broken. Resistance returned. Merchants renewed non-importation agreements. Women organized spinning gatherings and produced homespun cloth so families could avoid British textiles. Political writers warned that small taxes could become instruments of slavery if accepted without resistance. In Massachusetts, the legislature circulated a letter urging the colonies to coordinate their opposition. British officials ordered the letter withdrawn. Massachusetts refused. Tension rose in Boston, where customs officers were hated and smuggling was common. In 1768, British troops arrived to enforce order. Red-coated soldiers marched through narrow streets filled with civilians who viewed them as occupiers. The soldiers were often poorly paid. Some took second jobs, angering local workers. Insults became fights. Snowballs became stones. Every encounter carried the possibility of disaster. On the night of March 5, 1770, disaster came. A crowd gathered near the customs house. They surrounded a small group of British soldiers. Voices shouted. Objects flew. Confusion spread. Then shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead or dying. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native ancestry who became one of the most remembered victims of the confrontation. Patriot leaders called it the Boston Massacre. The name was propaganda, but the deaths were real. Paul Revere circulated an engraving portraying disciplined British soldiers firing into a helpless crowd. The image was inaccurate in important details, yet politically devastating. It transformed a chaotic street clash into a symbol of military tyranny. John Adams, a lawyer and cousin of Samuel Adams, made a different choice. He agreed to defend the British soldiers in court. Adams believed that even deeply unpopular defendants deserved a fair trial. Most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. The trial revealed a contradiction that would follow the revolution from beginning to end. Patriot leaders used emotion to mobilize resistance, but they also claimed to defend law, reason, and rights. For a time, the crisis cooled. Most of the Townshend duties were repealed, except the tax on tea. Trade resumed. Some colonists hoped the conflict had passed, but Samuel Adams and other activists refused to let the memory fade. Committees of correspondence spread information between towns and colonies. Every royal order, customs seizure, and political dispute became part of a larger story. The British government, in that story, was not making isolated mistakes. It was carrying out a plan to destroy American liberty. Whether such a plan truly existed mattered less than the fact that increasing numbers of colonists believed it did. Then came tea. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. The law was designed partly to rescue the financially troubled East India Company by allowing it to sell tea more directly in the colonies. Ironically, the tea could be cheaper than before, but it still carried the parliamentary tax. To accept the tea was to accept Parliament's right to tax. In several ports, colonial pressure forced tea ships to turn away or prevented their cargoes from being unloaded. Boston was different. Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted that the ships remain and the tea be landed. For weeks, the harbor became a stage on which neither side would retreat. On the night of December 16, 1773, a large group of men boarded 3 ships. Some disguised themselves in clothing meant to evoke Native Americans. They broke open more than 300 chests of tea and dumped the contents into Boston Harbor. The destruction was organized, not random. The men avoided stealing other cargo. They reportedly replaced a broken lock. But the value of the tea was enormous, and the political message was unmistakable. Boston had not merely protested British law. Boston had openly defied it. King George III and his ministers decided that an example had to be made. Parliament responded with a series of measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts government was restricted. Royal authority expanded. Officials accused of crimes could be tried outside the colony. New arrangements for quartering troops deepened colonial fears. British leaders believed they were isolating Massachusetts. Instead, they united the colonies around it. Food and supplies arrived in Boston from communities as far away as South Carolina. Colonists who had disagreed with the destruction of the tea now feared that if Parliament could crush Massachusetts, no colony was safe. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Georgia did not initially attend, but the meeting still represented an extraordinary act of intercolonial cooperation. The delegates were not yet creating a new nation. Many still hoped for reconciliation. They disagreed about tactics, goals, and how far resistance should go. Some were cautious. Others were prepared for a complete break. Patrick Henry of Virginia declared that old distinctions between colonies were fading. He was not merely a Virginian, he argued. He was an American. That identity was still fragile, but it had entered the room. Congress approved a boycott of British goods and endorsed the right of the colonies to govern their internal affairs. It also agreed to meet again if the crisis continued. Meanwhile, across New England, towns prepared for war. Militia units trained. Gunpowder and weapons were hidden. Men known as Minutemen promised to be ready at short notice. The colonists still sent petitions, but they were also collecting ammunition. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, understood the danger. From Boston, he watched a countryside slipping beyond royal control. In April 1775, Gage received orders to act. British troops would march into the interior, seize military supplies stored at Concord, and possibly arrest leading rebels. The operation was supposed to be secret. It was not. On the night of April 18th, riders carried warnings into the darkness. Paul Revere became the most famous of them, but he was not alone. William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, and many others helped spread the alarm. Church bells rang. Drums sounded. Militiamen left their homes and gathered with muskets in hand. Before dawn on April 19th, British soldiers reached Lexington. There, on the village green, they found a small line of colonial militia. The Americans were badly outnumbered. Their commander, Captain John Parker, did not intend to begin a battle. He ordered his men not to fire unless fired upon. Then a shot rang out. No one knows with certainty who fired it. But once the first shot came, discipline collapsed. British soldiers fired a volley. Bayonets flashed. Men fell. 8 colonists were killed at Lexington. The British continued to Concord, where they searched for weapons and supplies. At the North Bridge, colonial militia confronted them. This time, the Americans fired in organized ranks. British soldiers fell. The war had begun, and the most dangerous part of the day had not yet arrived. As the British column marched back toward Boston, thousands of militia gathered along the route. They fired from stone walls, trees, houses, and fields. The road became a running battle. British troops, exhausted and furious, struggled to maintain formation. Reinforcements saved the column from possible destruction, but the cost was severe. By nightfall, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or were missing. American losses were also significant. News traveled with extraordinary speed. The confrontation was described in taverns, churches, newspapers, and private letters. Each telling sharpened the meaning. British troops had marched into the countryside. Americans had resisted. Blood had been spilled. There could be no easy return to the world that existed before Lexington. Within days, thousands of New England militiamen surrounded Boston. The rebels had no unified army, no national government, and no clear plan. But they had trapped a British force inside the city. Across the colonies, people were forced to choose. Some saw the fighting as a defense of inherited British rights. Some believed independence was now unavoidable. Others remained loyal to the crown, fearing that rebellion would bring chaos, mob rule, and economic ruin. Many tried to remain neutral. Neutrality would become harder with every passing month. On May 10, 1775, the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. It faced an impossible situation. The delegates were not legally the government of a country, yet an army was already fighting in their name. Congress began acting like a national government because there was no alternative. It authorized the Continental Army, issued paper money, sought supplies, and appointed officers. The choice of commander was critical. New England had begun the war, but the rebellion could not survive as a regional uprising. It needed Southern support. John Adams nominated George Washington of Virginia. Washington was tall, reserved, and carried himself with extraordinary dignity. He appeared at Congress in military uniform, signaling that he was prepared to serve. He was not the most experienced soldier in America, and he had never commanded an army of this size. But he possessed something just as important. He could symbolize continental unity. Washington accepted command while declaring that he did not believe himself equal to the task. The words sounded humble. The responsibility was enormous. Before he reached Boston, the war produced its first major battle. American forces had fortified the heights overlooking the city. On June 17, 1775, British troops crossed the water toward Charlestown. The battle is remembered as Bunker Hill, although most of the fighting occurred on Breed's Hill. From a military perspective, the British objective was clear. They had to drive the colonists from the high ground. From a political perspective, they needed to prove that trained regulars could crush an army of farmers. The first British assault climbed into deadly fire. American defenders waited behind earthworks until the redcoats came close. Then they fired. Men dropped in rows. A second assault failed. Only on the third attack, as American ammunition ran low, did the British capture the position. Technically, Britain had won. But victory came at a horrifying price. More than 1,000 British troops were killed or wounded, including a large number of officers. The Americans had been forced to retreat, yet they had shown that colonial soldiers could stand against the British army. The lesson cut both ways. The Patriots learned that Britain could be resisted. The British learned that this rebellion would not be ended cheaply. When Washington arrived outside Boston in July, he found an army in name more than reality. The camps contained men from different colonies who obeyed different customs, elected some of their own officers, and had enlisted for limited periods. Supplies were scarce. Hygiene was poor. Disease spread easily. Gunpowder was dangerously low. Washington had to transform this armed gathering into a professional force before it dissolved. He imposed discipline. He demanded cleaner camps. He tried to standardize command. He struggled with desertion, drunkenness, short enlistments, and constant political interference. He also confronted the question of black military service. Free black men and enslaved men had fought at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Early policies restricted their enlistment, reflecting the racial fears and prejudices of white leaders. But manpower needs and British attempts to recruit enslaved people pushed the Continental Army toward allowing many black soldiers to serve. The Revolution was already exposing the conflict at its center. White colonists spoke of slavery as a metaphor for taxation. Hundreds of thousands of people in America lived in actual slavery. In Virginia, Royal Governor Lord Dunmore recognized that contradiction and turned it into a weapon. In November 1775, he issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people owned by rebels if they escaped and joined British forces. The offer was limited. It did not free all enslaved people, and it did not apply to those held by loyalists. Yet its impact was explosive. Enslaved men and women understood the war through their own pursuit of freedom. Many risked everything to reach British lines. Others served the patriot cause, sometimes in exchange for freedom, sometimes as substitutes for white owners, and sometimes because local circumstances left no simple choice. For them, the revolution was not one war. It was thousands of individual struggles to escape bondage, protect family, survive violence, and claim promises that neither side applied equally. Native nations also faced choices created by someone else's rebellion. Most did not view the conflict as a simple contest between liberty and tyranny. They saw two groups of Europeans fighting over power while colonial settlers continued moving onto indigenous land. The British Crown had at least attempted to limit settlement west of the Appalachians. Many native leaders, therefore, judged a British victory more likely to restrain American expansion. Others had close relationships with colonial communities or old grievances against Britain. The Oneida and Tuscarora would provide important support to the Americans, while many Mohawk, Seneca, Cherokee, Shawnee, and other groups aligned in varying ways with the British. The war would divide confederacies, villages, and families. And whichever European side won, native nations would pay a devastating price. While Washington besieged Boston, American forces launched an invasion of Canada. The idea appeared bold and perhaps even brilliant. If Canada joined the rebellion, Britain would lose a major base in North America. Congress hoped French-speaking Canadians might welcome liberation from British rule, but the campaign revealed the limits of American power. One column under Richard Montgomery moved north through Lake Champlain and captured Montreal. Another, led by Benedict Arnold, endured a brutal journey through the wilderness of Maine. Arnold's men suffered hunger, cold, exhaustion, and desertion. They boiled leather and ate whatever they could find. Yet Arnold reached Quebec with a force still capable of fighting. On the final night of 1775, in a blinding snowstorm, the Americans attacked Quebec. The assault failed. Montgomery was killed. Arnold was wounded. Hundreds of Americans were captured. The survivors maintained a weak siege, but disease and British reinforcements eventually drove them south. The Canadian invasion had begun with dreams of expansion. It ended in retreat. Benedict Arnold, however, emerged with a reputation for courage and endurance. Years later, his name would mean something very different. Back in Boston, Washington needed a way to force the British out without destroying the city. The answer came from artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Henry Knox, a young bookseller with a passion for military science, organized the transportation of heavy cannon across frozen rivers, mountains, and winter roads. It was an extraordinary logistical achievement. In March 1776, the guns were placed on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston and the harbor. The British commander understood immediately. His ships and troops were exposed. On March 17th, the British evacuated Boston and sailed for Halifax. The Americans celebrated. They had forced the King's army from one of the most important cities in the colonies. But Washington knew the victory could create dangerous confidence. Britain had not abandoned the war. It was preparing an invasion on a scale America had never seen. And the likely target was New York. While armies moved, the political meaning of the conflict changed. In 1775, many colonists still hoped to repair the relationship with Britain. Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, declaring loyalty while asking him to help end the crisis. The king rejected the appeal and declared the colonies in rebellion. Britain prepared to send more troops, including soldiers hired from German states, especially Hesse-Kassel. Americans called them Hessians. Their arrival strengthened the patriot argument that the crown intended to conquer its own subjects with foreign mercenaries. Then, in January 1776, a pamphlet appeared. Its title was Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, wrote with a directness that cut through years of constitutional argument. He attacked monarchy itself. He mocked the idea that an island should rule a continent. He insisted that America had the opportunity not merely to defend old rights, but to begin the world again. The pamphlet spread rapidly. It was read in taverns, homes, workshops, and military camps. People read it aloud to those who could not read it themselves. Paine gave ordinary language to an idea that had once seemed radical. Independence was not only necessary, it was possible. One by one, colonial assemblies instructed their delegates to support separation. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that the United Colonies were free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee to draft a public explanation. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a 33-year-old Virginia planter known for his writing, produced the draft. His language transformed a political break into a universal claim. All men are created equal. They possess unalienable rights. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive of those ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. These ideas were not entirely new. They drew from Enlightenment philosophy, English political traditions, colonial experience, and years of resistance. But placed together at that moment, they became revolutionary. They also carried a contradiction impossible to ignore. Jefferson enslaved human beings. Many delegates who approved the Declaration benefited from slavery. Women had no equal political standing. Native peoples were described in hostile language. The promise of equality existed beside systems of domination. The words did not accurately describe America in 1776. They created a standard by which America would be judged. Congress approved independence on July 2nd. It adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. Most delegates signed the formal parchment on August 2nd, with some signatures added later. Across the new states, the Declaration was read aloud. Crowds cheered. Symbols of royal authority were pulled down. In New York, a statue of King George was torn from its pedestal and later used, in part, to make bullets. The colonies had declared themselves states. But declarations do not defeat armies. At the very moment Americans announced their independence, a vast British fleet gathered near New York. Warships filled the harbor. Transports carried tens of thousands of troops. The British force included experienced regulars, German auxiliaries, artillery, cavalry, sailors, and marines. It was one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever sent overseas. Washington's army waded across a landscape of islands, rivers, and narrow waterways that favored British naval power. The Americans had made their promise to the world. Now they had to survive the answer. In the summer of 1776, New York became the center of the revolution. The city itself was small by modern standards, clustered near the southern end of Manhattan. But its harbor was magnificent, its rivers opened routes into the interior, and its population contained powerful loyalist networks. If Britain controlled New York, it could divide New England from the middle and southern states. Washington attempted to defend nearly everything. That was the problem. His forces were scattered across Manhattan, Long Island, and nearby positions. Many soldiers were inexperienced. Some had never heard enemy cannon. Illness weakened the camps. Commanders argued. Intelligence was incomplete. Across the water stood General William Howe, commander of the British Army, and his brother Admiral Richard Howe, commander of the fleet. The Howe brothers possessed overwhelming force. They also carried authority to offer pardons and seek peace if the Americans submitted. The British still hoped that a decisive defeat would collapse the rebellion. On August 27, 1776, they struck on Long Island. American commanders failed to guard a crucial route through the wooded heights. British troops moved through the pass during the night, turned the American flank, and attacked from the rear. The result was disaster. American units were surrounded. Men fled through marshes and fields. Some fought desperately at close range. Others surrendered in large numbers. Washington watched from behind defensive works near Brooklyn as his army broke. He had declared independence less than 2 months earlier. Now the largest army he had ever commanded stood in danger of annihilation. The British paused before attacking the main American position. That pause saved the revolution. Under cover of darkness and fog, Washington organized an evacuation across the East River. Boats moved silently through the night. Soldiers expected at any moment to hear British guns. By morning, the army had escaped to Manhattan. It was a brilliant retreat from a terrible defeat. But retreat became the pattern. The British landed on Manhattan. American troops panicked at Kips Bay. Washington, furious, rode among them trying to stop the collapse. At Harlem Heights, the Americans fought back with greater confidence, but they could not hold the island indefinitely. A fire destroyed a large part of New York City. Each side blamed the other. British forces occupied the ruins, and the city became their headquarters for the rest of the war. Fort Washington fell in November, costing the Americans thousands of prisoners and valuable supplies. Fort Lee was abandoned. British troops chased Washington across New Jersey. The American army shrank with every mile. Men deserted. Enlistments expired. Civilians rushed to declare loyalty to the Crown. Congress fled Philadelphia for Baltimore. General Charles Lee, one of Washington's senior officers, was captured after carelessly staying away from his troops. Thomas Paine marched with the retreating army and saw despair spreading through the ranks. He wrote a new pamphlet. These are the times that try men's souls. The words were read to soldiers who stood at the edge of collapse. By December, Washington had crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Fewer than 10,000 men remained under his immediate command, and many were sick or poorly equipped. Large numbers were scheduled to leave when their enlistments ended on December 31st. The revolution was weeks away from possible extinction. Washington needed a victory, not a symbolic gesture, not another retreat described as strategic. A real victory. Across the Delaware, Hessian troops occupied Trenton, New Jersey. They were professional soldiers under Colonel Johann Rall. Patriot intelligence suggested the garrison might be vulnerable, especially during the Christmas season. Washington created an ambitious plan. Several American columns would cross the ice-filled Delaware on Christmas night and converge on Trenton. Most of the crossings failed. Washington's force made it through. The night was brutal. Snow, sleet, wind, and freezing rain struck the men as they hauled artillery through darkness. Some soldiers marched with rags around their feet. The route took longer than expected. Dawn approached. Turning back would mean the likely end of the army. Washington continued. On the morning of December 26th, the Americans attacked Trenton from multiple directions. The Hessians attempted to form, but were overwhelmed in the streets. Colonel Rall was mortally wounded. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. American losses were remarkably light. The victory was small compared with the massive battles of Europe. Its psychological impact was enormous. The army that had been hunted across New Jersey had crossed a frozen river and defeated professional troops. The rebellion was alive. Washington crossed back into Pennsylvania with his prisoners, then returned to New Jersey. He persuaded men whose enlistments were ending to remain a little longer, appealing to their honor and offering additional pay. British forces under Lord Cornwallis advanced toward Trenton. On January 2, 1777, they confronted Washington near Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis believed he had trapped him. The Delaware was behind the Americans. British troops were in front. Cornwallis reportedly expected to finish the matter in the morning. That night, Washington left campfires burning and slipped away. His army marched around the British flank and attacked Princeton. The fighting was fierce and confused. At a dangerous moment, Washington rode forward to rally wavering troops. A volley erupted around him, and for several seconds his men feared he had been killed. He emerged unharmed. The British position in much of New Jersey became difficult to maintain. Patriot militia attacked supply lines. British troops withdrew toward stronger bases. Trenton and Princeton did not end the war. They changed its emotional direction. Washington had shown that he could recover from catastrophe, take calculated risks, and preserve the army under conditions that would have destroyed a less resilient commander. His greatest strategic insight was becoming clear. He did not need to conquer Britain. He did not need to win every battle. He needed to keep the Continental Army alive until Britain lost the will, the money, or the international freedom to continue. But survival alone would not be enough. America needed foreign help. From the beginning, leaders in Congress understood that independence could not be secured with courage alone. The states lacked money, weapons, gunpowder, uniforms, and a navy capable of challenging Britain. France possessed all of them. France also wanted revenge for its defeat in the 7 Years' War. American agents went to Europe seeking support. The most famous was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was already internationally celebrated as a scientist, writer, inventor, and philosopher. In France, he cultivated an image of Republican simplicity, appearing with plain clothing and a fur cap that fascinated Parisian society. Behind the performance was serious diplomacy. French officials secretly provided money and supplies. Weapons shipped through covert channels became essential to the Continental Army. Yet France hesitated to enter the war openly. Supporting a rebellion against a monarchy was dangerous. More importantly, the French government wanted proof that the Americans could survive. That proof would come from the north. British leaders developed a campaign intended to sever New England from the other states. General John Burgoyne would move south from Canada through the Lake Champlain and Hudson River corridor. A smaller force would advance through the Mohawk Valley. The armies would eventually connect with British forces coming north from New York City. On paper, the plan threatened the heart of the rebellion. In practice, it depended on distance, timing, communication, and cooperation between commanders who did not fully understand one another's intentions. Burgoyne began with confidence. His army included British regulars, German troops, loyalists, and native allies. He traveled with heavy baggage and the expectations of a European campaign. Early victories strengthened his reputation. Fort Ticonderoga, once celebrated as the gateway to Canada, was abandoned by the Americans after British guns appeared on high ground thought nearly impossible to occupy. The fall of the fort shocked the United States. But the farther Burgoyne moved south, the more difficult his campaign became. American forces destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and stripped the countryside of supplies. Forests that looked like empty space on British maps became barriers of mud, trees, and ambush. Burgoyne needed horses, food, and wagons. He sent a force toward Bennington, expecting to seize supplies. Instead, American militia destroyed or captured much of the detachment. In the Mohawk Valley, the supporting British column faced resistance at Fort Stanwix. A relief force of local militia was ambushed near Oriskany in one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of the war. The fighting divided communities in the Haudenosaunee, or Six Nations Confederacy, as native warriors found themselves on opposing sides. The British advance in the valley eventually withdrew. Burgoyne was increasingly alone. The use of native allies also produced a political disaster after the killing of Jane McCrae, a young loyalist woman. The circumstances remain uncertain, but Patriot propaganda portrayed her death as proof that Britain had unleashed uncontrolled violence on civilians. Militia recruitment surged. Meanwhile, General Howe did not march north from New York to support Burgoyne. He sailed south to capture Philadelphia. Howe believed taking the American capital could force a decisive political collapse. But Philadelphia was not London. Congress could move. The rebellion did not depend on a single city. Washington attempted to stop Howe at Brandywine in September 1777. Once again, British forces executed a long flanking movement. Once again, American intelligence and coordination failed. The Continental Army was defeated. Philadelphia fell. Members of Congress fled. British officers occupied comfortable homes. Loyalists celebrated. Yet the American government continued operating elsewhere. Washington attacked the British at Germantown in October. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex, requiring multiple columns to move through darkness and fog. Confusion ruined the attack, but the Americans fought aggressively enough to impress European observers. While Howe held Philadelphia, the truly decisive campaign unfolded around Saratoga. American forces gathered under General Horatio Gates. Benedict Arnold served as one of his most energetic commanders, though the two men distrusted each other. At Freeman's Farm in September, Arnold pushed for aggressive action. The fighting was intense and inconclusive, but Burgoyne's losses were harder to replace. His supplies dwindled. American numbers grew. Then, at Bemis Heights on October 7th, Burgoyne attempted another attack. Arnold, officially deprived of command after quarreling with Gates, rode into battle anyway. He moved across the field with reckless courage, rallying troops and driving attacks against British positions. He was wounded in the same leg injured at Quebec. The Americans broke the British defenses. Burgoyne retreated north but found escape impossible. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered more than 5,000 troops at Saratoga. It was the victory America had desperately needed, not because it destroyed the British Army, not because it ended the fighting, but because news of Saratoga crossed the Atlantic and changed the war from a colonial rebellion into an international conflict. France now believed the United States might survive. In February 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed treaties of alliance and commerce. The revolution had gained a powerful ally. Britain had gained a global war. The alliance with France was a triumph. But in the winter of 1777, triumph felt very far away. After losing Philadelphia, Washington moved his army to Valley Forge, about 20 miles from the occupied capital. The name would later become a symbol of heroic suffering. The reality was more complicated, and in some ways more powerful. Valley Forge was not the coldest winter of the war. The army was not simply abandoned in a frozen wilderness. It occupied a strategic position from which it could watch British movements and protect supply routes. But the suffering was severe. Thousands of soldiers lacked adequate shoes, coats, blankets, and food. Men left bloody footprints in the snow. Horses starved. Poor sanitation encouraged disease. Typhus, dysentery, influenza, and other illnesses killed far more soldiers than British bullets during the encampment. The deeper problem was not that America had no food. It was that the new nation lacked an effective system to collect, transport, and distribute it. Congress had limited power. The states protected their own supplies. The continental currency lost value as more paper money entered circulation. Farmers often preferred to sell to British buyers who could pay in reliable gold or silver. Washington wrote furious letters. Officers pleaded for help. Soldiers watched nearby countryside produce food they could not obtain. The army appeared close to disintegration. Then the camp began to change. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived from Europe presenting himself as a Prussian military officer of significant rank. His exact background had been embellished, but his skill was real. Steuben understood that the Continental Army did not need to become a copy of the Prussian army. It needed a practical system that soldiers from different states could learn and officers could repeat. He began with a model company. He personally demonstrated drills, sometimes shouting through translators and filling the air with profanity when language failed. The soldiers learned how to march in formation, maneuver under fire, load and fire efficiently, use the bayonet, establish camps, and follow standardized commands. The changes were not glamorous. They were revolutionary. For years, the army had depended on courage without consistency. At Valley Forge, it began developing a shared professional identity. Another foreign volunteer, the Marquis de Lafayette, became personally close to Washington and politically valuable to the alliance with France. Young, wealthy, and idealistic, Lafayette had crossed the Atlantic against the wishes of his own king. He fought at Brandywine, endured the army's hardships, and became one of the most famous links between the American and French causes. Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's most trusted generals, took responsibility for the quartermaster system and improved the movement of supplies. Women were also essential to the survival of the army. Some followed military camps because their families had no other source of support. They cooked, washed clothes, repaired garments, carried water, nursed the sick, and sometimes faced battle themselves. Their work was often poorly paid and rarely celebrated, but armies could not function without it. Other women managed farms, shops, and households while husbands, sons, and brothers were absent. They dealt with shortages, inflation, military requisitions, displacement, and the constant possibility that war would reach their homes. The revolution expanded women's responsibilities without granting them equal political power. Abigail Adams had famously urged her husband John to remember the ladies when new laws were made. The new governments did not create gender equality, but the upheaval weakened some old assumptions and opened arguments that would not disappear. By the spring of 1778, the army leaving Valley Forge was still poorly supplied and imperfectly trained, but it was stronger than the army that had entered. The British now faced a changed strategic situation. France possessed a powerful navy and colonies around the world. Britain had to defend the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, West Africa, India, and its own shores. Later, Spain and the Dutch Republic would also enter conflicts against Britain, widening the struggle. The American Revolution became part of a global war for empire. This transformation is one of the central reasons the 13 states ultimately survived. Britain could send armies to America. It could not concentrate all of its strength there forever. Fearing that a French fleet might trap the army in Philadelphia, the British evacuated the city and marched across New Jersey toward New York. Washington followed. On June 28, 1778, the armies met at Monmouth Courthouse. The day was brutally hot. Heat exhaustion killed men on both sides. The battle began with confusion when the American advance force under General Charles Lee withdrew unexpectedly. Washington encountered retreating troops and confronted Lee in one of the most dramatic moments of his command. He reorganized the line and prepared for the British assault. The Continental Army held. The fighting ended without a decisive victor, and the British continued to New York. But Monmouth demonstrated that the Americans could now meet British regulars in a sustained open battle without collapsing. The army trained at Valley Forge had proved itself. The story of a woman later remembered as Molly Pitcher became associated with Monmouth. The name may combine the experiences of more than one camp follower, but women did carry water under fire, assist artillery crews, and take dangerous roles during the battle. The legend survived because it represented a wider truth. The revolution was not fought only by the famous men whose portraits would fill future textbooks. It depended on people whose names were lost. After Monmouth, the war in the North settled into a tense stalemate. The British held New York City. Washington watched from outside. Large battles became less frequent, but violence continued through raids, skirmishes, espionage, privateering, and brutal local conflict. No place revealed the character of civil war more clearly than the frontier and the contested regions between armies. Patriots and loyalists often knew one another. They attended the same churches, traded in the same markets, and belonged to connected families. When political disagreement became war, old rivalries gained weapons. Property was confiscated. Suspected enemies were imprisoned. Homes were raided. Men joined militia units for ideology, fear, revenge, or survival. Loyalists were not a single group. Some were wealthy officials tied to the crown. Others were recent immigrants who valued imperial stability. Some were enslaved people pursuing British promises of freedom. Some were native nations attempting to resist settler expansion. Some were ordinary farmers who feared patriot committees more than distant parliament. Patriots were equally varied. They included merchants angered by imperial regulation, artisans seeking political influence, plantation owners protecting local power, small farmers defending community autonomy, intellectuals inspired by Republican ideas, and people simply drawn into the side that controlled their region. The war forced choices, then punished those choices. In the Hudson and Mohawk valleys, raids destroyed farms and villages. British Allied forces, loyalists, and native warriors attacked frontier settlements. Patriot forces retaliated with campaigns that devastated indigenous communities. In 1779, Washington ordered General John Sullivan to lead a major expedition against Haudenosaunee towns associated with British resistance. The Sullivan campaign destroyed villages, crops, and food supplies across parts of Iroquois. Homes were burned. Orchards were cut down. Thousands of indigenous people fled toward British protection near Fort Niagara and suffered terribly through the winter. The campaign reduced the ability of some communities to support British operations, but it did not create lasting security. It deepened hatred and accelerated the destruction of native independence. The Six Nations Confederacy, one of the most sophisticated political alliances in North America, had been split by the war. Mohawk leader Joseph Brant supported the British and became feared on the American frontier. Oneida leaders and warriors supported the Patriots and supplied vital intelligence and assistance. When the war ended, even native nations that had helped the Americans found their land threatened by the new republic. For indigenous peoples, American independence did not mean the end of empire. It often meant a more aggressive empire had moved closer. The war at sea also widened. The Continental Navy was small and could not defeat the Royal Navy in a conventional struggle. But American privateers transformed merchant ships into legal raiders authorized to capture enemy vessels. Thousands of sailors took part. They disrupted British commerce, seized supplies, created insurance costs, and forced Britain to divert naval resources. Privateering mixed patriotism with profit. A successful cruise could make a crew wealthy. A failed one could end in death or years inside a prison ship. British prison ships anchored near New York became symbols of suffering. Disease, overcrowding, hunger, and neglect killed thousands of American prisoners. One of the most famous naval commanders was John Paul Jones. In 1779, commanding the Bonhomme Richard, Jones fought the British warship Serapis off the coast of Britain. The battle was savage. Ships locked together. Cannon fire tore through decks. Flames spread. When asked whether he had surrendered, Jones was later credited with declaring that he had not yet begun to fight. The exact wording is uncertain. The outcome is not. Jones captured the Serapis even as his own ship was sinking. The victory did not control the Atlantic. It shocked Britain by bringing the war into waters close to home. France, meanwhile, struggled to coordinate effectively with its new ally. A French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing arrived in 1778, raising enormous American hopes. Plans to attack the British at Newport, Rhode Island, collapsed after storms, naval maneuvering, disagreement, and damaged ships. American soldiers felt abandoned. Anti-French anger briefly surfaced. The alliance existed on paper. Making it work in battle would require patience. That patience was about to be tested in a new theater. Britain's northern strategy had failed at Saratoga. Holding New York had not ended the rebellion. Capturing Philadelphia had not destroyed Congress. So British leaders looked south. They believed the southern states contained deep loyalist support. They expected thousands to rally to the crown once British troops arrived. They hoped to restore Georgia, then South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, rolling north through the colonies while the Royal Navy controlled the coast. The strategy was not foolish. The South did contain many loyalists. But British planners underestimated the violence required to hold territory after regular troops moved on. They also underestimated the ability of the Revolution to become a vicious local war. And in the South, that war would reach its bloodiest form. The Southern campaign began with a British success. In December 1778, British forces captured Savannah, Georgia. The following year, a combined American and French attempt to retake the city ended in a bloody failure. The attack at Savannah was rushed and direct. Allied troops advanced against strong defenses and were torn apart. Among those mortally wounded was Casimir Pulaski, a Polish cavalry officer who had joined the American cause. The British tightened their control over Georgia. Then they moved against Charleston. Charleston was the largest city in the South and one of the wealthiest cities in North America. Its prosperity rested heavily on enslaved labor and the rice economy of the Carolina Low Country. In early 1780, General Henry Clinton brought a major British expedition south. He approached Charleston carefully, combining land forces with naval power. American commander Benjamin Lincoln allowed his army to become trapped inside the city. The siege closed around them. On May 12th, Charleston surrendered. More than 5,000 American troops became prisoners. It was one of the worst defeats of the entire Revolution. The British now controlled the most important city in the South. Patriot resistance appeared broken. Loyalists stepped forward. Clinton returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis to complete the conquest. For a brief moment, the Southern strategy seemed to be working exactly as planned. Then the countryside exploded. British officers established posts across South Carolina. They demanded oaths of loyalty and attempted to restore royal government. But occupation created resistance. Men who might have remained neutral were forced to choose. Some who accepted British protection later learned they were expected to fight for the crown. Partisan leaders emerged from swamps, forests, and backcountry settlements. Francis Marion, later called the Swamp Fox, led small mobile forces that attacked British communications and disappeared into difficult terrain. Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens organized other militia groups. These men became patriot heroes, but the partisan war was not clean or romantic. It included ambush, robbery, retaliation, destroyed homes, and personal vengeance. Loyalist militia carried out similar operations. Communities were torn apart. At Waxhaws in May 1780, British cavalry under Banastre Tarleton crushed an American force commanded by Abraham Buford. Many Americans were killed during and after the collapse of their line. Patriot accounts described the event as a massacre and turned the phrase Tarleton's Quarter into a rallying cry. Tarleton became one of the most hated British officers in America. His speed and aggression made him effective. His reputation made resistance more determined. Congress sent General Horatio Gates south to restore the situation. Gates carried the fame of Saratoga, although much of that victory had depended on others. He gathered an army and moved toward Camden. South Carolina. The campaign began badly. Supplies were inadequate. Many soldiers were sick. Gates pushed forward anyway. On August 16, 1780, the Americans encountered Cornwallis near Camden. Gates placed inexperienced militia opposite some of the strongest British regulars. When the British advanced with bayonets, large parts of the American line broke almost immediately. The defeat became a rout. Gates fled far from the battlefield. Baron de Kalb, a respected Continental officer, was mortally wounded after fighting with extraordinary courage. The Southern Army had been destroyed again. The revolution in the Carolinas now depended heavily on militia and local resistance. But Britain faced a dangerous contradiction. The more it relied on loyalists to control territory, the more the war became a struggle between neighbors. And every act of revenge created another enemy. That autumn, a British officer named Major Patrick Ferguson led Loyalist militia into the Western Carolinas. He warned frontier rebels to submit or face destruction. Instead, militia from the backcountry and the settlements beyond the mountains gathered to hunt him. These over-mountain men moved rapidly through difficult terrain. On October 7, 1780, they surrounded Ferguson's force on Kings Mountain. The battle was fought on steep wooded ground. Patriot riflemen climbed from multiple directions, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Loyalists charged downhill with bayonets, driving them back, but the Americans returned again and again. Ferguson was killed. His force surrendered. Kings Mountain destroyed a major Loyalist army and weakened British control in the backcountry. It also proved something the British Southern strategy had failed to understand. Loyalist strength was real. So was Patriot strength. The Crown could not mobilize one without provoking the other. Washington and Congress now turned to Nathanael Greene. Greene had lost battles before. He had served as quartermaster. He had made mistakes. But Washington trusted his judgment, energy, and ability to hold an army together. When Greene reached the South, he found a military disaster. His force was small, poorly equipped, and operating across a vast region. Cornwallis had stronger regular troops and a reputation for aggressive action. Greene made a daring decision. He divided his army. Conventional wisdom warned against splitting a weaker force in front of a stronger enemy. Greene understood that the countryside could not supply a single concentrated army for long. By dividing his troops, he could threaten multiple British posts, gather food more easily, and force Cornwallis to choose which Americans to pursue. One wing moved under Daniel Morgan, an experienced frontier officer and veteran of earlier campaigns. Cornwallis sent Banastre Tarleton after him. The pursuit ended at Cowpens on January 17, 1781. Morgan chose his ground carefully. He understood both his own militia and Tarleton's personality. American militia were often criticized for running. Morgan turned that weakness into part of his plan. He placed riflemen forward, then militia behind them, with Continental regulars on stronger ground farther back. The first lines were instructed to fire limited volleys and then withdraw. Tarleton arrived exhausted but attacked quickly, believing Morgan was trapped. The American skirmishers fired and fell back. The militia fired and withdrew. To the British, it looked like another collapse. Tarleton pushed forward. Then the trap closed. The Continental line held. American cavalry struck. Militia who had withdrawn returned to the battle. A misunderstood order briefly caused part of the American line to retreat, but Morgan turned the movement into an organized maneuver. The British force was surrounded and shattered. Cowpens was a tactical masterpiece. Hundreds of British troops were captured. Tarleton escaped, but his elite force was largely destroyed. Cornwallis responded with fury and determination. He burned much of his baggage so his army could move faster and chased Greene north across the Carolinas. What followed became known as the Race to the Dan. Greene combined forced marches, careful river crossings, local intelligence, and prepared boats to stay ahead. Cornwallis came close, but could not trap him before the Americans crossed the Dan River into Virginia. The British Army had marched itself deep into hostile territory with exhausted men and limited supplies. Greene rested, gathered reinforcements, and returned. On March 15, 1781, he offered battle at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Like Morgan at Cowpens, Greene deployed his army in multiple lines. The battle was fierce. Militia fired and withdrew. Continental troops fought British regulars at close range. Units became mixed in smoke and woodland. Cornwallis finally took the field, But his victory was ruinously expensive. Roughly a quarter of his army was killed or wounded. One British politician later observed that another such victory would destroy the British army. Greene had retreated, yet Cornwallis could not remain. He moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, seeking supplies. Then, instead of continuing to chase Greene, he marched north into Virginia. Greene made another bold choice. He moved south again. Rather than follow Cornwallis, he attacked British posts across South Carolina. He lost several battles in a narrow tactical sense, but each engagement weakened the British network. One post after another fell or was abandoned. Greene understood the difference between winning a battlefield and winning a campaign. By the end of 1781, the British remained in Charleston and Savannah, but much of the interior had returned to Patriot control. The Southern strategy had consumed British armies without restoring the Southern colonies. And Cornwallis, searching for a decisive result, was moving toward Virginia. Before his march ended, the Revolution nearly suffered its most famous betrayal. Benedict Arnold had been one of the bravest American commanders of the war. He had helped capture Fort Ticonderoga, led the terrible expedition to Quebec, built a fleet that delayed the British on Lake Champlain, and played a central role at Saratoga. He had also been wounded repeatedly, passed over for promotion, criticized by rivals, and investigated for his conduct. Arnold believed he had sacrificed more than almost anyone and received ingratitude in return. His resentment grew. He lived beyond his means. He married Peggy Shippen, a young woman from a prominent Philadelphia family with Loyalist connections. Through secret correspondence, Arnold began communicating with the British. The betrayal was not a sudden emotional collapse. It was a calculated negotiation. Arnold offered information. Then he offered something far more valuable. West Point, the American fortress on the Hudson River, controlled a strategic position that could help the British separate New England from the other states. Washington trusted Arnold enough to give him command there. Arnold planned to weaken the defenses and deliver the post to the enemy in exchange for money and rank. In September 1780, British Major John Andre met Arnold and received documents related to West Point. The plan unraveled when American militiamen stopped Andre on his return to British lines and discovered the papers. Arnold learned that the plot had been exposed and escaped aboard a British ship only hours before Washington arrived. Andre was tried as a spy and hanged, despite efforts to save him. Arnold received a British commission and later led raids against his former countrymen, including destructive attacks in Virginia and Connecticut. His military value to Britain was limited. His name became a permanent synonym for treason. But Arnold's betrayal also revealed how fragile the American cause remained. Officers were unpaid. Promotions caused bitterness. Congress lacked money. The army suffered. Loyalty could not be assumed. In January 1781, Pennsylvania troops mutinied over pay, conditions, and enlistment disputes. They did not abandon the revolution or join the British, but they marched with weapons and demanded justice. A smaller New Jersey mutiny was suppressed more harshly. The Continental Army was not a machine driven by pure patriotism. It was made of human beings who expected promises to be kept. By 1781, many of those promises had been broken. The states struggled to provide men and money. Continental currency had collapsed so badly that the phrase "not worth a continental" became a warning about useless paper. Congress operated under the Articles of Confederation, America's first national framework. The Articles preserved the independence of the states and gave the central government limited authority. Congress could conduct diplomacy, direct the war, and issue money. But it could not effectively tax individuals. It depended on requests to states that often arrived late or not at all. The revolution had begun partly as a resistance to distant centralized power. Now the Americans were discovering that a government too weak to act could also threaten liberty by failing to survive. Robert Morris, appointed superintendent of finance, worked to stabilize the situation. He used personal credit, reorganized financial administration, and helped support the final campaigns. Yet money alone would not end the war. Everything depended on whether the Americans and French could create one decisive concentration of force before the alliance fractured, the army dissolved, or Britain recovered. The opportunity would appear in Virginia. But at first, almost no one understood what was about to happen. Virginia had not been the center of the war for most of the Revolution. By 1781, that changed. The state was politically important, economically valuable, and vulnerable to naval attack. Rivers cut deep into the land, allowing British ships to move troops and supplies far inland. Tobacco warehouses and plantations offered resources. The presence of thousands of enslaved people created both labor for the Patriot economy and opportunities for British disruption. Benedict Arnold led British raids through Virginia early in the year. He burned supplies and attacked Richmond. American forces were too weak to stop him. Lafayette was sent south with a small continental force. He was only in his early 20s, but he had matured since arriving in America as an idealistic volunteer. His task was difficult. Follow stronger British forces, protect key supplies, avoid destruction, and wait for help. Then Cornwallis entered Virginia from the Carolinas. He joined with other British units and took command of a powerful field army. For a time, he seemed capable of sweeping Lafayette aside. Cornwallis tried to trap him. Lafayette withdrew carefully, refusing the decisive battle the British commander wanted. Reinforcements eventually strengthened the Americans under Anthony Wayne and Baron von Steuben. The campaign became a contest of movement. British cavalry raided widely. At Charlottesville, Tarleton nearly captured members of the Virginia legislature, including Governor Thomas Jefferson. The lawmakers escaped, but the humiliation was sharp. At Green Spring in July, Cornwallis set a trap that nearly destroyed an American force under Wayne. Wayne escaped by ordering a bold charge that shocked the British long enough for the Americans to withdraw. Cornwallis still held the advantage on land, but his orders from British Commander Henry Clinton in New York were confused and sometimes contradictory. Clinton feared an attack on New York and wanted troops returned. He also wanted a secure naval base in the Chesapeake. Cornwallis eventually moved to Yorktown, a small port on the York River, and began fortifying the area. Across the river at Gloucester Point, British forces established another position. Together, the works protected an anchorage where the Royal Navy could supply or evacuate the army. The location appeared safe because British sea power had dominated the war. That assumption would destroy Cornwallis. Far to the north, Washington and the main Continental Army remained near New York. The French army under the Comte de Rochambeau had arrived in Rhode Island in 1780, but cooperation was slow. The French troops were disciplined, well-equipped, and commanded by experienced officers. They also represented a monarchy fighting beside a republic that had rebelled against another king. Washington wanted to attack New York. Rochambeau doubted the operation would succeed without naval superiority. The city was strongly fortified, and British ships could reinforce it. The Allies waited for the French fleet. The key decision was made in the Caribbean by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse. De Grasse commanded a major French naval force. He could sail north for a limited period before returning to Caribbean operations. When he informed the Allied commanders that he intended to enter the Chesapeake, the entire strategic picture changed. Washington shifted his plan. The target would be Cornwallis. Secrecy was essential. If Clinton understood the movement, he could send reinforcements from New York or order Cornwallis to escape. Washington maintained the appearance of preparing an attack on New York while the American and French armies began marching south. The movement was one of the greatest logistical achievements of the war. Thousands of soldiers traveled hundreds of miles. Supplies, artillery, wagons, and animals had to move with them. Roads were poor. Money was scarce. Some American troops had not been paid and resisted marching until funds were found. French silver helped. Washington rode through Philadelphia at the head of an Allied army. Crowds watched men from different nations moving toward a destination most did not yet know. For Washington, the march carried personal meaning. He passed near Mount Vernon, his Virginia home, which he had not visited for years. He briefly returned before continuing to the campaign that could decide the war. At sea, everything depended on de Grasse. A British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves arrived off the Chesapeake in September 1781. The French sailed out to meet it. The Battle of the Chesapeake was not a dramatic annihilation. Ships exchanged heavy fire, maneuvered, and suffered damage. But the British failed to break French control of the bay and withdrew toward New York for repairs. The strategic result was decisive. Cornwallis was trapped by a naval battle in which no American ship of the line had taken part. Another French squadron arrived with siege artillery from Newport. The Allied armies gathered around Yorktown. By late September, More than 16,000 American and French troops faced roughly 8,000 British and German soldiers. The siege began. Engineers directed the digging of trenches known as parallels. Under darkness, soldiers moved closer to the British lines. Artillery batteries were constructed. Fascines, gabions, and earth protected the crews. Then the Allied guns opened fire. Day and night, cannonballs and explosive shells struck Yorktown. British buildings shattered. Horses were killed. Defenses crumbled. Soldiers slept little and waited for the next impact. French artillerymen brought professional expertise. American batteries joined them. Washington personally fired one of the opening guns, according to tradition. The British fired back, but their position worsened. Two advanced redoubts blocked completion of the next Allied trench. They had to be captured. On the night of October 14th, two assault columns moved forward. French troops attacked Redoubt No. 9. American light infantry under Alexander Hamilton attacked Redoubt No. 10. Hamilton had long sought a battlefield command. He was one of Washington's most talented aides, but he feared being remembered only as a staff officer. His men advanced with unloaded muskets and fixed bayonets, hoping to preserve surprise. They crossed obstacles, climbed the works, and fought at close range. The redoubt fell in minutes. The French also captured their objective after fierce resistance. The Allied siege line tightened. Cornwallis attempted a sortie to destroy artillery, but gained only temporary relief. He then tried to evacuate troops across the York River to Gloucester Point, from which they might break through and escape. Boats began moving in darkness. A sudden storm scattered them. The last path closed. On October 17th, a British drummer appeared on the parapet. An officer carrying a white flag followed. Negotiations began. 2 days later, the British army marched out. Cornwallis did not attend the formal surrender, claiming illness. General Charles O'Hara represented him and attempted to offer the sword to Rochambeau. The French commander directed him toward Washington. Washington, following military protocol, directed him to American General Benjamin Lincoln, who had surrendered Charleston the previous year. Lincoln accepted. The symbolism was perfect. A humiliation answered. British soldiers laid down their weapons as Allied troops stood in two long lines, Americans on one side and French on the other. A legend later claimed that the British band played a tune called The World Turned Upside Down. The evidence is uncertain. The phrase survived because it felt true. The empire had not been defeated by Americans alone. It had been defeated by an alliance, by French money, French soldiers, French artillery, and above all French naval power. It had been defeated by British strategic confusion. It had been defeated by the ability of Washington's army to survive long enough for one perfect opportunity. It had been defeated by militia, privateers, spies, diplomats, women who sustained households and camps, enslaved people who disrupted the labor system, and civilians who continued supporting a cause through years of hardship. Yorktown was the final major battle, but the war was not yet formally over. British troops still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. The Royal Navy remained powerful. Fighting continued in some places. No one could be certain that London would abandon the struggle. When news reached Britain, the political shock was enormous. Lord North, the Prime Minister, reportedly reacted as if struck by a cannonball. Public support for continuing an offensive war in America had already weakened. The conflict was expensive. Britain faced enemies across the world. Yorktown made the cost of reconquest impossible to ignore. The government fell. A new ministry opened the path toward peace. The 13 states had survived the battlefield. Now they had to survive diplomacy. The peace negotiations revealed that alliances built during war could become rivalries at the table. American diplomats in Europe included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and later Henry Lawrence. They were intelligent, ambitious, and often suspicious of one another. They also understood that the future of the United States depended on more than British recognition. The new nation wanted territory. It wanted the Mississippi River as its western boundary. It wanted access to fisheries in the North Atlantic. It wanted the British to leave frontier forts. It wanted independence recognized not as a temporary concession, but as a permanent fact. France had been essential to victory, yet French and American interests were not identical. France wanted to weaken Britain, but it did not necessarily want the United States to become too powerful. Spain, fighting Britain as France's ally, had its own concerns about territory and the Mississippi Valley. John Jay became convinced that the Americans should negotiate directly with Britain rather than depend entirely on French mediation. The Americans violated their instructions from Congress and opened separate talks. The decision was risky. It worked. British negotiators were willing to offer generous boundaries partly because they hoped future trade with the United States would restore economic influence and separate America from France. Preliminary articles were signed in November 1782. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. Britain recognized the United States as free, sovereign, and independent. The new nation's territory stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to the northern boundary of Spanish Florida. Though borders remained disputed and indigenous nations had not consented to American claims over their homelands, Americans gained fishing rights in important North Atlantic waters. Congress agreed to recommend that states restore confiscated Loyalist property, and both sides addressed debts owed to British creditors. The treaty looked like an extraordinary American diplomatic victory, but words on paper did not settle every conflict. The British retained frontier posts for years, citing American failures to honor treaty obligations. States often ignored recommendations to compensate Loyalists. Disputes over debts continued. The borderlands remained violent, and the indigenous nations whose land had been transferred from one power to another were not represented in the negotiations. For them, the Treaty of Paris was not a peace treaty. It was an announcement that the United States intended to expand. Before the final peace, the Continental Army faced one last internal crisis. Officers had gone years without reliable pay. Congress had promised pensions that seemed increasingly uncertain. In early 1783, anonymous addresses circulated among officers gathered at Newburgh, New York, urging them to consider forceful action against Congress. The possibility of a military challenge to civilian government was real enough to alarm Washington. He called a meeting. Washington opposed the officers' grievances only in the sense that he rejected military coercion. He knew they had been treated unfairly. He had argued repeatedly for their pay. But he also understood what was at stake. If the army that claimed to defend Republican liberty used weapons to control the government, the revolution could end in military rule. Washington addressed the officers and warned them against those who would open the gates of civil discord. The men remained tense. Then Washington took out a letter from Congress. He began to read, struggled, and reached for a pair of spectacles. He apologized, saying that he had grown gray and almost blind in the service of his country. The moment broke the anger in the room. Many officers wept. The crisis passed. Congress later arranged a compromise on compensation. Washington had won battles by retreating, by waiting, and by attacking at the right moment. At Newburgh, he may have saved the Republic by allowing hardened officers to see the personal cost of command. The final British evacuations followed. Savannah was abandoned in 1782. Charleston in December of that year. New York remained the last great British stronghold. On November 25, 1783, British forces evacuated the city. American troops entered as crowds celebrated. The departure was not a simple scene of liberation. Thousands of Loyalists left with the British. Families abandoned homes, businesses, and communities. Some went to Britain. Many went to Canada, where their arrival reshaped the future of the northern colonies. Others traveled to the Caribbean or different parts of the empire. Black Loyalists faced an uncertain fate. During the war, thousands of enslaved people had escaped to British lines. At the evacuation of New York, British officials recorded the names of many black people departing in a document known as the Book of Negroes. Some gained freedom in Nova Scotia, though they encountered discrimination, broken promises, and severe hardship. Some later migrated to Sierra Leone in West Africa. Others were re-enslaved or transported into brutal plantation systems elsewhere in the empire. Freedom had been promised in wartime language. Its reality depended on power, documentation, location, and survival. Enslaved people evacuated with the British were a source of bitter dispute. American slaveholders demanded the return of what they called property. The British often refused, though outcomes varied. For many black Americans, neither side had offered universal emancipation. But the war created openings through which individuals and families seized freedom for themselves. On December 4th, Washington met his officers. At Frances Tavern in New York, the commander, who was famous for emotional control, struggled to speak. He embraced his officers one by one, then departed. Later that month, he traveled to Annapolis, where Congress was meeting. On December 23, 1783, George Washington resigned his commission as commander-in-chief. The act astonished observers in Europe. Victorious generals did not always surrender power. They sometimes became dictators, kings, or permanent military rulers. Washington returned authority to civilian representatives and went home to Mount Vernon. King George III reportedly said that if Washington truly gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. The story may have been polished over time, but the significance was real. The revolution ended not only with British surrender. It ended with the American commander surrendering his own command. Yet independence did not instantly create unity. The United States in 1783 was exhausted. The war had killed tens of thousands through battle, wounds, disease, imprisonment, and hardship. Exact numbers remain debated because records are incomplete. The population had suffered displacement, inflation, shortages, destroyed property, and fractured communities. The economy was damaged. Trade networks had been disrupted. Public and private debts were enormous. Soldiers returned home with little money. Widows and wounded veterans struggled for support. The states had fought together, but they remained deeply protective of their sovereignty. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress lacked reliable revenue and enforcement power. It could request funds, but could not compel states to provide them. It could negotiate treaties, but struggled to ensure state compliance. It could declare policies for Western territory, but lacked the means to manage every conflict created by expansion. Some Americans saw this weak structure as protection against tyranny. Others saw it as a path toward national collapse. The revolution had answered one question. Britain would not rule the United States. It had not answered how Americans would rule themselves. State governments wrote constitutions and experimented with Republican power. Some created stronger legislatures. Others attempted to balance branches. Property requirements limited voting, though political participation expanded for many white men in the following decades. New ideas spread through public debate. If government rested on consent, who counted as the people? If all men were created equal, how could hereditary privilege survive? How could slavery survive? How could women be expected to raise virtuous Republican citizens while being denied equal civic rights? How could a nation claim liberty while taking native land without consent? The revolution did not solve these contradictions. It made them impossible to silence forever. In the northern states, slavery began a slow and uneven retreat. Vermont's 1777 Constitution prohibited adult slavery in principle, though practice was imperfect. Pennsylvania adopted gradual abolition in 1780. Massachusetts courts interpreted the state constitution's language of equality in ways that helped end legal slavery there. Other northern states later adopted gradual emancipation laws. In the South, slavery remained central and would expand dramatically. Some individual slaveholders freed people during the Revolutionary era. Religious and philosophical opposition to slavery grew. Free black communities petitioned for rights and challenged the nation to honor its language. But the new United States did not abolish slavery. Its greatest declaration of equality coexisted with human bondage. The contradiction would shape every generation that followed and ultimately helped drive the country into civil war. Women's contributions were widely praised in symbolic language, yet political equality did not follow. The idea of Republican motherhood encouraged women to become educated so they could raise informed citizens. This could expand access to education, but it still defined women's public importance largely through service to men and family. Women had managed farms, defended homes, organized boycotts, produced supplies, carried intelligence, followed armies, nursed soldiers, and in rare cases fought while disguised as men. After the war, most were expected to return to a legal and political order dominated by men. They remembered what they had done. So did later generations seeking equality. Loyalists faced confiscation, exile, humiliation, or difficult reintegration. Not every loyalist left. Many remained and adapted to the new order. Communities sometimes sought reconciliation because survival required it. But scars endured. The revolution was remembered as a united people overthrowing foreign rule. For those who lived through it, the conflict often looked like neighbor against neighbor. Native nations experienced some of the most devastating consequences. The British had negotiated away territory they did not fully control. American settlers moved west with renewed confidence. Land companies, veterans, state governments, and individual families looked beyond the mountains. The United States treated military victory over Britain as victory over indigenous peoples who had fought for their own sovereignty. War continued across the Ohio Country and other frontiers. The revolution that created American independence accelerated the loss of native land. This was not an accidental side effect. Western expansion had been one of the forces driving colonial anger since the proclamation of 1763. The empire had tried, however imperfectly, to slow settlement. The new republic wanted the frontier open. For white settlers, the West represented opportunity. For native nations, it represented invasion. For Britain, losing the 13 colonies was a profound shock, but not the end of the empire. Britain retained Canada, Caribbean colonies, possessions in India, and global naval power. It learned from the defeat, reformed parts of its imperial administration, and built an even larger empire in the 19th century. British trade with the United States revived quickly because political independence did not erase economic need. American merchants still wanted British manufactured goods. British businesses still wanted American raw materials and customers. The war had broken sovereignty. It had not broken the Atlantic world. France gained revenge and prestige, but the war deepened its financial crisis. French officers returned home carrying stories of American liberty. The monarchy had spent enormous sums helping the United States defeat Britain. Within a decade, France would face its own revolution. The connection was not simple. The French Revolution had many causes, but the American War added debt, ideas, and examples to an already unstable system. Spain recovered Florida and gained strategic advantages, but worried about the example of colonial rebellion. Across the Atlantic world, the language of rights and revolution traveled farther than American leaders could control. In Haiti, enslaved people would launch the most successful slave revolution in history. In Latin America, independence movements would challenge European empires. The American Revolution did not create every later revolution. It proved that an empire could be defeated and a new republic could claim a place among nations. That example was more powerful than any army. In the years immediately after the war, Americans discovered that defeating an empire was easier than building a durable union. Peace removed the common enemy that had held the states together. Commercial disputes returned. States taxed goods from neighboring states. Congress struggled to pay debts. British troops remained in western forts. Spain controlled the lower Mississippi and restricted American access. European powers doubted whether the United States would survive. Farmers who had fought in the Revolution faced taxes and debt at home. In western Massachusetts, economic pressure contributed to an uprising associated with Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain. Shays' rebellion in 1786 and 1787 frightened many political leaders. To them, it proved that the Confederation government could not maintain order or protect national credit. Others saw a different lesson. They saw ordinary people resisting a government that ignored their suffering, just as the colonies had resisted Britain. The debate cut to the heart of the revolution. How much power could a government possess before it threatened liberty? How little power could it possess before liberty became impossible to defend? In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they created an entirely new constitution. George Washington presided over the convention. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and other leading figures debated representation, executive power, federal authority, commerce, slavery, and the balance between large and small states. The result created a stronger national government with power to tax, regulate commerce, raise armed forces, and enforce laws. It also protected slavery through political compromises without using the word directly. Enslaved people were counted for representation under the 3/5 clause, increasing the political power of slaveholding states. The international slave trade received temporary protection. Fugitive slave provisions strengthened slaveholders' claims. The Constitution solved some weaknesses of the Revolution while embedding some of its deepest contradictions. Ratification produced another national argument. Supporters called Federalists believed the new government was necessary for survival. Opponents feared that the Constitution recreated the distant power Americans had just defeated. The promise of a Bill of Rights helped secure ratification. In 1789, Washington became the first president under the new Constitution. The Bill of Rights followed, protecting freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, due process, and other liberties against federal power. These protections grew from the experience of resistance to Britain, but they also grew from fear of the American government itself. The Revolution had taught Americans not to trust power simply because it claimed good intentions. That suspicion became part of the national structure. Yet the political system did not include everyone equally. The United States began as a republic with remarkable possibilities and severe exclusions. Its ideals would inspire abolitionists, women's rights activists, labor movements, civil rights leaders, immigrants, and reformers. Those same ideals would also be used to hide injustice behind national mythology. The meaning of the revolution would never be fixed. Every generation would fight over who inherited its promise. So how did 13 colonies defeat the British Empire? The simplest answer is that they did not defeat it alone. Without France, American victory would have been extraordinarily unlikely. French weapons helped supply the Continental Army. French loans and subsidies supported the government. French soldiers fought beside Americans. French naval power made Yorktown possible. Spain, though not formally allied with the United States, fought Britain and stretched British resources. Bernardo de Galvez led campaigns that captured British positions along the Gulf Coast, including Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola. Spanish support through the Mississippi Valley aided the wider struggle. The Dutch entered war with Britain and added further pressure. Britain's conflict with the colonies became a contest against multiple imperial rivals. The Royal Navy had to protect trade routes, islands, ports, and possessions across the world. British leaders feared threats to the valuable sugar colonies of the Caribbean. They worried about invasion at home. They fought in India, the Mediterranean, and other theaters. America was important. It was no longer the only war. Geography also favored the rebellion. The 13 states stretched along more than 1,000 miles of coastline and extended deep into forests, mountains, rivers, and frontier regions. Britain could capture cities, but cities did not control the entire country. Boston fell to the Americans, yet the war continued. New York fell to the British, yet the war continued. Philadelphia fell, yet Congress continued. Charleston fell, yet resistance spread through the countryside. To conquer the United States, Britain had to do more than win battles. It had to occupy territory, protect supply lines, rebuild loyal government, suppress militia, and convince civilians that the rebellion had failed. Every British success required garrisons. Every garrison reduced the army available for the next campaign. Distance magnified every problem. Orders crossed the Atlantic slowly. A plan created in London could be outdated before it reached America. Generals operated with incomplete information. Reinforcements and supplies depended on weather and shipping. The British Army was highly professional, but it was not limitless. It relied on German auxiliary troops because Britain lacked enough regular soldiers for the expanding war. It recruited loyalists, native allies, and formerly enslaved people. These forces made major contributions, but coordination was difficult and political consequences were often severe. British commanders also disagreed about strategy. Howe captured New York and Philadelphia, but failed to destroy Washington's army. Burgoyne marched south expecting support that never came. Clinton and Cornwallis communicated poorly. The Southern campaign won major battles, but could not translate battlefield success into lasting control. Britain repeatedly mistook the capture of places for the collapse of the Revolution. The Americans understood, sometimes through painful experience, that the army mattered more than any single city. George Washington was not an undefeated military genius. He lost more battles than many legendary commanders. He made serious mistakes at New York, Fort Washington, Brandywine, Germantown, and elsewhere. He could be proud, cautious, angry, and politically sensitive. His greatness came from a different quality. He learned. He understood that the Continental Army was the physical symbol of national resistance. If it survived, the revolution survived. He avoided risks that could destroy it. yet accepted enormous risks when the cause required them, as at Trenton and Yorktown. He held together officers from rival states. He managed relationships with Congress. He worked with French commanders despite cultural tension. He endured years of criticism without using the army to seize political power. Washington's strategy was endurance. His most important victories were sometimes escapes. American political commitment also mattered. The states repeatedly failed to supply the army fully, but they supplied enough to keep it alive. Congress was weak, but it continued meeting. Local governments raised militia, gathered provisions, enforced loyalty, and sustained the rebellion. The decentralized nature of American resistance created inefficiency. It also made the revolution difficult to decapitate. There was no single palace to capture, no king to imprison, and no capital whose fall automatically ended the war. The British were fighting a network of governments, armies, committees, militias, merchants, communities, and private citizens. That network could bend without completely breaking. Ideology gave the struggle meaning. Patriots did not all agree on what liberty meant. Many had economic motives. Some were coerced. Some changed sides. Some sought land, local power, or revenge. But ideas still mattered. The belief that government required consent helped people endure sacrifice. Newspapers, sermons, pamphlets, public readings, and political meetings turned military events into a moral story. Common sense made independence understandable. The Declaration gave it a universal language. Washington became a symbol of perseverance. Trenton restored hope. Saratoga proved survival. Valley Forge became a memory of shared hardship. Nations are not held together by facts alone. They are held together by stories people are willing to suffer for. The Patriots told the more powerful story to enough of the population for long enough to win. But victory should not be confused with universal support. A substantial part of the population remained loyalist or attempted neutrality. The exact proportions cannot be known with precision. Allegiance changed by time and place. Many people cared more about family, land, religion, community, or survival than abstract constitutional theory. The revolution was won not because every colonist became a patriot. It was won because Britain could not convert its American support into stable control while patriot institutions continued functioning. Militia played a crucial but complicated role. Militiamen sometimes fled. They could be unreliable for long campaigns. They often resisted serving far from home. Yet they provided local intelligence, harassed supply lines, reinforced the Continental Army, controlled communities, and made occupation dangerous. At battles such as Kings Mountain and in partisan warfare across the South, militia became decisive. The Continental Army and militia were not competing explanations for victory. They depended on one another. The army provided endurance and professional force. The militia made the country difficult to hold. Civilian sacrifice mattered just as much. A soldier could not remain in the field if no one planted crops, managed accounts, produced cloth, cared for children, or maintained the household left behind. Women preserved farms and businesses, organized boycotts, gathered supplies, and served around armies. Civilians endured requisitions from both sides. Families fled combat zones. Merchants risked cargoes. Communities absorbed wounded soldiers and refugees. The revolution was sustained in kitchens, barns, workshops, roads, ports, and sick rooms as much as on battlefields. Enslaved people changed the war through their own decisions. By escaping plantations, offering labor or military service, carrying intelligence, negotiating with armies, and pursuing freedom, they weakened slaveholding economies and forced both sides to confront manpower and loyalty. The British promise of freedom was inconsistent and strategic, but it opened a path used by thousands. Patriot military service also produced freedom for some black men, especially in northern states. The outcome did not free the majority, but the actions of black Americans made them participants in the revolution, not passive subjects of someone else's story. Native nations shaped campaigns, intelligence, diplomacy, and frontier warfare. Their alliances affected the northern and southern theaters. Their knowledge of terrain and regional politics was invaluable. Yet the eventual American victory was often catastrophic for them. A complete history must hold both truths at once. Native peoples influenced the result. The result accelerated the attack on native sovereignty. Luck also played a role. fog helped conceal the retreat from Long Island. Weather disrupted operations repeatedly. Burgoyne became isolated while Howe moved toward Philadelphia. Cornwallis chose Yorktown. De Grasse chose the Chesapeake. The French fleet defeated British strategic timing at exactly the moment the Allied armies moved south. History is not destiny revealed after the fact. It is a chain of decisions made without knowledge of the ending. At several moments, a different wind, delayed message, failed river crossing, or captured commander might have changed the war. The Americans won because they survived enough disasters to benefit when opportunity finally appeared. Britain did not lose because it was weak. It lost because its strength was required everywhere, because its political goals demanded more than battlefield victory, and because the cost of forcing millions of colonists back into obedience eventually exceeded the value British leaders believed they could recover. The final defeat happened in Parliament as much as at Yorktown. An empire can continue fighting after losing an army. It cannot continue indefinitely after losing the political will to replace it. The American strategy, whether fully planned or discovered through experience, turned time into a weapon. Every year the revolution survived increased British expense. Every year created another chance for foreign intervention. Every failed British campaign made reconciliation less likely and independence more real. By 1781, the question was no longer whether Britain could win another battle. It was whether another battle could restore an empire already transformed by 6 years of war. Yorktown answered no. The myths came later. Paintings showed clean uniforms and heroic poses. Speeches turned complicated men into flawless founders. The Civil War became a united uprising. French assistance faded behind images of American self-reliance. Enslaved people, native nations, women, loyalists, and ordinary soldiers moved to the edges of the story. The real revolution was greater than the myth because it was more human. Its leaders doubted. Its soldiers deserted and returned. Its people argued, profited, sacrificed, betrayed, endured, and changed. Victory did not arrive in a straight line. It came through Boston streets, frozen rivers, failed invasions, prison ships, disease camps, burning villages, diplomatic salons, southern swamps, and siege trenches in Virginia. It came through men who wanted liberty while denying it to others. It came through people denied liberty who used the chaos of war to pursue it anyway. It came through an alliance between a republic and a monarchy. It came through a general whose most revolutionary act may have been walking away from power. The United States was not born finished. It was born as an argument. The Declaration announced equality. The society violated it. The Constitution created a stronger republic. The compromises protected injustice. The revolution destroyed one form of political dependence while leaving many forms of domination intact. That does not make its ideals meaningless. It makes them unfinished. The words of 1776 became weapons used by people the founders had excluded. Enslaved petitioners quoted natural rights. Abolitionists invoked the Declaration. Women demanded that consent apply to them. Civil rights leaders insisted that the nation honor its own promise. The revolution continued long after the muskets fell silent because its language allowed every generation to ask the same dangerous question. If liberty is a right, why does it stop with you? That question is the revolution's greatest legacy. Not the image of men in powdered wigs. Not the romance of a battlefield charge. Not the belief that America was destined to win. The legacy is the tension between power and principle. Between the country that existed and the country its words claimed it could become. In 1763, almost no colonist imagined an independent United States stretching to the Mississippi River. In 1776, many Americans expected Washington's army to be destroyed. In 1777, Philadelphia was occupied and the government was in flight. In 1780, Charleston had fallen, the Southern Army had collapsed, and one of America's greatest generals had become a traitor. In 1781, unpaid soldiers stood near mutiny while the government struggled to feed them. Then French sails appeared in the Chesapeake. Allied trenches closed around Yorktown, and an empire discovered that it had run out of exits. The British surrender did not prove that the Americans were stronger. It proved that power has limits when distance, resistance, diplomacy, geography, and time combine against it. The 13 colonies defeated the British Empire because they refused to disappear before the empire became exhausted. They turned defeat into delay, delay into alliance, alliance into opportunity, and opportunity into independence. On the field at Yorktown, the muskets were stacked and the flags were lowered. But the true end of the revolution came later, when the soldiers went home, the exiles sailed away, the enslaved searched for freedom, native nations prepared for another invasion, and Americans faced the question victory could no longer postpone. They had proven that they could reject a king. Now they had to prove that free people could govern themselves. That struggle would be longer than the war. In many ways, it is still unfinished. History remembers the moment America won its independence. But the deeper story is what independence demanded, what it destroyed, what it failed to deliver, and what it made possible. The revolution did not create a perfect nation. It created a promise powerful enough to expose every imperfection that followed. And that may be why its story still matters. Because the most important question is not whether the Patriots were destined to win. They were not. The question is whether the liberty they claimed can ever be complete while it is denied to someone else. The British Empire lost 13 colonies. The world gained a new republic. And humanity gained an argument that has never truly ended.